There's so much pressure on podcasting to say, well, you're not successful unless you're monetizing it. Podcasting has become much more mainstream. You could do better by getting your own sponsors. We've seen podcasting has just taken off. More and more people know what it is. For a relatively small budget, you could produce an incredible podcast to compete with the best podcasts out there. It's way easier for someone to get into podcasting now than it was when we first started. When we started Buzzsprout, we want to not just be a host that puts files on the internet. We want to be a host that actually helps you as a podcaster achieve those goals that you set out when you started your podcast. You as a podcaster should really ask yourself the question of why did you get into podcasting? You can define success rather than having it defined for you. One of the most dangerous things in podcasting, I think, is...
Tom, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus. We are going to talk about a lot of things today, but once is not usual. Can we maybe start by having you introducing yourself? For the people who might not know who Tom Rossi is, who are you and what do you do?
Sure. Thank you for having me on the podcast. My name's Tom Rossi, and I am one of the co-founders of Buzzsprout. We are a podcast hosting company. We help podcasters get their podcasts out to the world and help them keep podcasting, help them accomplish those goals that they set out when they start their podcast. And I am specifically the technical co-founder, so I am mostly on the technical side, writing code and doing all those fun things to help Buzzsprout do what it does.
The fancy stuff. Tom, how does one end up creating Buzzsprout? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had a product that was in the nonprofit space and ended up working with a lot of churches. And churches wanted to put their sermon audio on the internet. And it was a podcast, right? Like that's what it was, is you created an RSS feed and you uploaded your MP3s. And so we had all these help articles trying to help them, do it themselves. And we finally were like, we just need to build this as a product. And so Buzzsprout really was born out of another product that we had where we just recognized the need. And this is 2008, 2009. So it was still early on in terms of podcasting. Not a lot of people knew what podcasting was. Even our customers, they didn't know it was a podcast. They just wanted to distribute their audio. And, I think a lot changed when Apple launched the podcast app and when the iPhone really took off.
100%. But sorry, I'm going to have to dig deeper into this. How do you end up helping nuns make their... So what was it, just recording the kind of prayer that they were doing? Or what was that? How do you...
It's the sermons.
The sermons, right.
For a long time, churches have had... in the old days, it was a tape, like cassette tape, and they would record it on a cassette tape. And then people that weren't able to make it to church, they'd be able to bring them a cassette tape and they could hear, what the pastor shared on that weekend. And it's been around for a long time. It was tapes, and then it was CDs, and then at some point it switched over to podcasts of just being able to go listen to it on the internet. So that way, if you're not at the service, you'd be able to listen to it on your own. And that was our first group of customers where it was from this other product. And what was surprising was we had an odd mix of churches and DJs.
Okay. Why it's not some parallel industries, so to say.
Right. They got into podcasting. I guess they were into podcasting pretty early. We had tons of DJs that would upload just hour-long beats, just like into like an hour and a half. And I think it was like their resume, of how they would share their music with folks. But then since then, obviously, we've seen just any topic you can come up with, we've seen on Buzzsprout.
Right. Man, that is such an amazing creation story, like helping out nuns for their sermons and DJs get into more parties. Quite interesting. So I'm having your LinkedIn profile open as we speak, Tom. And
sure.
Co-founder of Buzzsprout for 15 years and 9 months. So you've been in the space for a decent amount of time now. How have you seen, and it's going to be particularly interesting because you're in the technical side of it, how have you seen Buzzsprout as a hosting and distribution platform for podcasts evolve? And so to speak, how have you seen the space and the industry evolve throughout those 16 years? Like, what are the things that were needed back then? How to help out and giving your sermons? to now helping out thousands, dozens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of podcasters broadcasting their show. What has been the evolution?
Yeah, I think podcasting has become much more mainstream. When we first got into podcasting, there were very few people that that took advantage of it. Like I said, the nonprofits, the churches that we worked with, they just wanted to get their audio out, right? Mm-hmm. And then you had DJs; they just wanted to get their audio out. They didn't know it was a podcast. They didn't necessarily, right? Whereas now everyone, like literally, it's more than half of, or almost half of the U.S. population is a monthly podcast listener, and so it's much more attainable. It's much more. People know what it is and they want it. They want to start a podcast. They want to start, talking about that thing that is important to them, mm-hmm. right? Like that's what I love about podcasting is there's so many different topics. And so we've seen it evolve where people have a specific thing that they want to share with the world. And podcasting is just a phenomenal way to be able to do that. The barriers to entry are really low. Being able to just get a microphone and record and then start, putting it out there and getting people to listen to it. And there's so many little niches of people. I was, have you ever heard of the Enneagram?
What?
The Enneagram?
I haven't.
The Enneagram is a personality test.
Okay.
And it's a lot, it's similar to the Myers-Briggs and, there's a bunch of these different personality tests. Okay. But right now there's all these people that are excited about the Enneagram. And I saw there was a podcast and it was specifically for like Enneagram 3s. It's a particular personality type. So you're talking about a niche within a niche within a niche, right? It was a podcast specifically for that one personality type. And it was a great podcast. Like I met them at a conference and I love the Enneagram and listened to a couple of their episodes. And it's just like a niche. It's such a niche thing. So anyways, going back to your original question, what have we seen? We've seen podcasting has just taken off. More and more people know what it is. It used to be people didn't like, what is a podcast? That doesn't happen nearly as often as it used to. People have their own go-to podcasts they listen to. Mm-hmm. It's way easier for someone to get into podcasting now than it was when we first started. When we started Buzzsprout, we were the only host that was making it really easy. Right. All of our competitors at the time were just way too complicated. And they were built for technical people, for audio engineers and things like that. Well, now you fast forward and the industry has matured a ton. Mm-hmm. And so we have some great competitors out there that are doing this, similar work to us of trying to make podcasting easy. Mm-hmm. Where we've evolved, I think, is recognizing the role that we can play, not just building an RSS feed, but helping encourage podcasters. So figuring out ways that we can eliminate some of the complexities associated with everything that goes on after you record it, right? Before and after you record it. And so we have features like magic mastering where we can take the audio and automatically master it and set the levels. And so you don't have to spend a lot of time doing that. We have a feature called Co-Host AI, which listens to the audio and it gives you recommended titles and descriptions. We have a remarkable support team which interact with our podcasters, and we answer questions that are all over the map. They're not just about Buzzsprout. They're anything to do with podcasting. Right. And so all of those features are designed to help podcasters accomplish their goals when they started their podcast, which is, they want to be a consistent content creator. And you know it. I mean, you have a podcast, you know how difficult it can be. And we want to not just be a host that, puts files on the internet. Mm-hmm. We want to be a host that actually helps you as a podcaster achieve those goals that you set out when you started your podcast.
Yeah. So that's the thing that I remember making us go for Buzzsprout when we started into the podcasting space, like how easy it was to just manipulate everything. How do you remain competitive in a space that attracts more and more people? Because, big media starts to really look into podcasts for ads. Hosting companies are all over the place. You have Spotify playing the big bully game now that they are the first one in terms of downloads. They just overtook Apple Podcasts. How do you, as a hosting platform, remain competitive among podcasters? How does that work?
I think it depends on how you look at it. How do we remain competitive as a podcast hosting company is what we want to provide, that remarkable support. We want to help podcasters achieve what they set out to do. And so what they'll say is, I don't know why, but I felt, more supported. I felt like there was people on my team. I didn't feel alone. So many times in podcasting, you just feel like you're speaking into the void, and is there anybody out there? And so having a tool set that's friendly and a support team that's available and tools that make it so that you spend less time doing the things that suck the life out of you, I think that's where we want to differentiate ourselves. Yeah. But part of it too is, building features for our podcasters that we think podcasters want, right? Like I go back to this idea of I'm a simple guy. I feel like in terms of business, we provide value. People pay you for the value, right? If something is free, it's confusing. Like, okay, wait, how is this working, right? And so we have always been like, look, we host your file, you pay us for it, we provide you this tool set, right? And so people would be like, yeah, but how are you making money? And you're like, remember, you're paying us monthly. Like that's so it removes the guesswork of what we're doing, and also removes the temptation to try to make money other ways. So we tell our podcasters that we're thinking about you all the time. What features make sense for you, the podcaster? Yeah. We're not trying to come up with, what makes the most sense for advertisers? What makes the most sense for us to grow our network? What makes the most sense for this or that? We're always asking the question, what can we do for our podcasters? Because they're the ones that are paying the bill. And I think that provides a little difference in the industry where you have some players that they're not totally transparent. Oh yeah, we'll host your podcast, we'll do it for free. Well, how are they doing that? It costs money, right? It costs real money to be able to do that. And the answer is, you're not their customer, right? And so anyways, I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like that's a lot of what we see in the industry.
100%. No, that makes lots of sense. And so talking about features a bit, Tom, to take a bit of a tangent here. One of the things that is getting big right now in the podcast space is obviously video. I think Google has officially announced a phasing out for the rest of the world of Google Podcasts. It's already official and done in the US. Because probably that those guys there wants to double down on YouTube and YouTube Music, and we see more and more people recording with as much high quality video as possible with their podcast. How do you see this personally and at Buzzsprout? Like, what is video doing to the podcast industry for you and for Buzzsprout?
I think video is confusing the podcast industry.
Interesting.
I think YouTube is trying to redefine a podcast. They're trying to call their YouTube shows podcasts, and that's confusing to podcasters. And so they'll say things like, "Oh, this is the number one place that people get their podcasts is YouTube." And then you've got podcasters that are like, "Wait a minute, I thought it was Apple. I thought it was Spotify," and it's confusing the industry, and it's putting pressure on podcasters to go down a video path. And it's not that video isn't something that you can definitely use to help promote your podcast, that you could definitely connect with your listeners over YouTube. The problem is when podcasters who are already, it's a hobby, it's something that they do, they're not quitting their day job, but now we're talking about setting up 3 cameras and editing video versus editing audio, like the production costs, and it sucks the life out of that thing that podcasters originally got into. Yeah. And so I think that's where I'm coming from. Does video play a part in podcasting? To a certain degree, it can, but a podcaster doesn't have to feel the need that they have to do video. And if you think about just as a podcast listener, how you consume content, you're much more engaged with an audio podcast than you are with a video. If you go and you watch a video on YouTube, I mean, you're very rarely going to make it all the way to the end before YouTube has found something else to entice you to click on to go somewhere else, right? Like, it's a different thing where an audio podcast is something I'm listening to when I'm driving. I'm listening to it when I'm doing something else. It's the majority of podcast consumption is happening in that way, but it's more intimate. It's like it's in your ear and it's just you and the podcast host, or the content that you're consuming. And it's different when you consume that same content over video.
Right.
It's just different. And now you're competing with the likes of Netflix and everybody else. It's much different where you can, for a relatively small budget, you could produce an incredible podcast to compete with the best podcasts out there. Yeah. Well, that's not true with video, right? Like you're going to compete with Dune 2, right? That's my new favorite. It's my new favorite.
Wait a second. They have had the authors. I know you're talking about the movie, not the video game. Okay.
Oh yeah. No. The movie. Yeah. But right, like you're talking about the same medium that could release Dune 2 is the same medium that you as a podcaster are going to release your podcast. Right? It's gonna be it's just different. Right? Video is different than audio, and the confusion that's coming into the industry right now is not good for podcasting.
I mean, come on. Between an episode of Podcast Gurus and Doom 2. It's a no-brainer. But more seriously, I like one of the things you said earlier, which is, I completely align on that, is the barrier to entry in the podcast world is so low that anybody can do it. And that's the whole point. Like, if you have a message, if you have something you want to shout out to the world, maybe you're going to get listened by 10 people, maybe 100, maybe 1,000, maybe even more. That's the advantage of this specific format. Like, it's so easy to get in. You just get everything set up. You can basically record a podcast episode with your iPhone or your phone. No, don't want to make any particular ads for Apple Podcasts. Having that video on top of it means that the barriers to entry is a bit higher. I wouldn't say it's
much higher.
Right. I wouldn't say it's something that you have to do doing the video, but it definitely kind of increases the barrier to entry. So talking about making it easy for people and making potentially, a living out of the podcast. I don't know if you can make a living out of the podcast, but Tom, what have you seen throughout those almost 16 years of founding and developing Buzzsprout, also on the back end of it? What are the best ways to monetize a podcast? What are the different alternatives? And what have you seen as an evolution in the space in that regard?
Sure. I would say when you start your podcast, you have to ask the question, like, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish with your podcast? Is it to quit your day job? Because that's a lot of pressure that you're putting on it. Is it a hobby that you'd like to be able to talk about this thing and find other people that are interested in hearing it? And by the way, maybe I'll make a little bit of money to be able to buy a microphone or pay for my some of my expenses, but I'm getting into it as a hobby. And so it's like any other hobby. Do you make money off of that? Do you approach it that way? So it really depends on the goal going into the podcast is what is it that you want to get out of it? And there's so much pressure on podcasting to say, well, you're not successful unless you're monetizing it. You're not successful unless you're making this money. And I'm like, that's just not true. Because there's so many other ways that people use podcasts. There's so many other ways that people extract value from it. And so coming up with what is it? What is it that you're setting out to do? And I would say if it's to quit your day job, there's a lot of pressure on your podcast. And what we've seen is podcasts tend to grow over a long period of time. They don't explode overnight. It's, planting seeds in a vineyard, and you gotta water it and you gotta tend it, and it grows over time. It's very different. So I think the industry has evolved to a place now where they're trying to dictate what is a successful podcast and how do you build a successful podcast. And it's going to be based on how many downloads do you get. And we're going to put ads in there. We're going to pay you a CPM. We're going to pay you dollars per every 1,000 downloads. And it just doesn't have to be that way. And I talk to, that's what I love about independent podcasters is they're all over the map. They do so many different things. And so I was just at PodFest last year, and I was talking to a podcaster who was telling me, I was asking this question because we have a program called Buzzsprout Ads, which allows you to do ads, right?
Right.
And I was talking to podcasters about, do you monetize your podcast? If so, how do you monetize it? And one of the podcasters I was talking to said, he's like, podcasting for me is my business card. He's like, I've got courses, I've got books, I've got all these different things that I sell through relationship on my podcast. It's my business card, and people hear it. They associate these things with me, and then they buy my products. So he's like, yeah, how do you describe that in terms of monetization? He doesn't really care how many downloads he gets. He cares how many sales he gets as a result of people downloading. And that's something very different. And it's also, it's a whole business built of which the podcast is part of it, not the only thing, right? He's got these other things that he's doing within the business, as opposed to putting all the pressure of the business on just the podcast. Mm-hmm. And where I feel like there's a lot of people that would be like, oh, well, don't you want to put ads in that podcast? And his response would be, do I want to put an ad on my business card?
Right.
Like, does that make sense to put a little logo on my business card that says, hey, go check out this other product? No, I'm not trying to make money off my business card. My business card is just the entry point for people to find out who I am. And then hopefully they want to engage with me. Mm-hmm. I know other podcasters that are consultants, and if they get one customer, their customers are $100,000 plus customers. Jeez. And so how many downloads do they need to be successful, right? They certainly don't need to think about ads. So really, there's just a lot of different ways that people can extract value from their podcast, and you can't allow all these big businesses that only make money a certain way to dictate what a success looks like for your podcast and how do you extract value from your podcast, because there's just too many different ways to do it.
No. So I love that. You touched upon a concept earlier that was something I wanted to dig into, which is CPM, so cost per meal, right? Which is the French running 4,000.
Oh, I didn't know that. That is French.
Yeah, right. Really? Meal? So that's the French 4,000. It's basically how much 1,000 views or downloads would typically bring you. So I know, because I was interested into the YouTube space at some point, which might become quite topical again in the podcast sphere, but let's focus on podcast now. On YouTube, you could hope, I think it was something between $5 and $50 CPM, depending on how qualitative your audience was and so on and so forth. What are we looking at in terms of podcasts? You who are in the place, obviously, with Buzzsprout. What is typical ad budget and ad revenue that we can expect as a CPM as a podcaster?
I mean, that's the problem, right? It's so many different types of podcasts. And so how do you put a dollar? So this is a common question, right? Oh, I've got a potential sponsor, or I've got a potential advertiser that wants to advertise on my podcast. How much should I charge?
Yeah.
And it really depends on your content. So do you have a very tight niche, where the audience is exactly the audience that the brand wants to connect with? If so, you should be able to charge more. You shouldn't be compared to other podcasts that maybe are more general, more broad, and so maybe they're going to hit less of the audience. So that being said, there are numbers that are out there in terms of this is typically what you see for example, we have Buzzsprout ads and we pay $14 CPM. So that's what a podcaster can make by approving an ad that shows up. But could they make more on their own? Absolutely. If they go out and they, get their own relationship with somebody, if you've got a Dungeons and Dragons podcast and you go and you find a product, you find some cool looking dice or something and you promote that on your podcast, you're going to have a much better return on that investment, right? Because it's exactly what they're looking for. But if you're doing a BetterHelp ad in a Dungeons and Dragons podcast, well, how many people is it going to resonate with? How many people are looking for that? So all that to say, yeah, there's tons of guidance that's out there in terms of numbers of what you can charge. I just think podcasters are better off not. I mean, for most part, sometimes your podcast gets so big, right? The 1% of the podcasts that are out there are so big, it makes sense for them to just outsource it. And I don't care if it is a BetterHelp ad because I just want to make money off of the ads. So for them, that might be a fine strategy. But for the 99% of podcasts that are out there, I think it's a mirage to chase that you're gonna do so well with the CPM model.
Yeah. Do I sense a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, Tom?
Oh yes,
that's what. Oh yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
What are you playing?
Well, I am big into Baldur's Gate right now, so it's so much fun. My husband and I are playing it, and we have a campaign, that we've been doing for a while, and it just brings back all the best memories of playing Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, and yeah.
Man, that's just my dream, playing Baldur's Gate with my son. Oh my God. Are you done with the game yet, or do you still?
No,
okay. Not gonna spoil it. Oh man, game of the decade, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
I know we are the podcast, but like Baldur's Gate 3, if you can play it, game of the decade.
So if this was a promo for Baldur's Gate, Dungeons and Dragons podcast, like it is such a good fit. Like how valuable is that? It's huge.
Yeah. But so how do you? So we have clients. So I have a metric in mind, but I want to get your feel for it first, Tom. What can people? So let's say I'm just putting. So let's take a basic example. I'm making 10,000 downloads a month. I'm going to a very traditional ad agency saying, hey, I want to put ads on my show. What can you propose? And then I will just use the dynamic ad insertion of Buzzsprout, little shout out, to put the ads. How much can I expect? And that's the least relevant potential ad, but also the easiest, right? Because it's just plug and play. Like, okay, you're going to get this ad from those people displayed on your podcast from pre and mid-roll and post-roll sometimes. How much can I expect when it's the least relevant possible and just like mass kind of media?
Right. So for us, it's $14. And ours is a little bit different in that the advertiser is buying the number of downloads. We insert it for that number of downloads, and then we remove it. But you don't have, it's not like geo-targeting. We're not trying to figure out information about the person that's listening to your podcast that, now we're figuring out what area of the world they are, what maybe they've purchased in the, 6 months that I might be able to target them with some specific ad. Like we're not doing any kind of targeting or anything like that. You're approving the ad, we're inserting the ad until they get the number of downloads that they said they wanted to purchase. And that purchase that they made was across a category of podcasts. So not just your podcast. They could be in 8 other podcasts at the same time. So for us, it's $14. And I always tell people it's the lowest form of monetization in my estimation, right? Like, could it pay for a microphone? Is it a way for you to, put a check in a box with very little effort and be able to make some money? Yeah, absolutely. But it is the lowest form of monetization. You could do better by getting your own sponsors or your own advertisers that you insert your own little ads. And so you say, hey, this is Tom, and I want to tell you about a product that I tried out, and it's this new 20-sided dice that looks amazing. And if you want to up your game, click on the link in my show and you're going to get 20% off. Like that's such an affiliate relationship like that. It's just, there's just so much, it resonates with your audience too, right? They're less likely to skip through it because it's actually relevant to the content that they're listening to.
Yeah.
And so it's just a better way to build on the trust. And so it's kind of like you can build on top of all these different strategies to figure out what is the one that makes sense for you. And I would caution podcasters to not, trade on the trust that their listeners have given them by putting up ads that aren't what they're, that's not why they're listening. They're not listening to get that ad. And so when you do that, you're kind of telling them, like, I'm going to take the trust that you've given me and I'm going to shove an ad in front of you versus, man, I vetted this. Or better yet, guys, I hope you enjoy the podcast. I hope you're getting a lot out of this show, but I want you to know it costs me something. I bought a microphone and I'm paying for hosting and blah, blah, blah. And so if you get any value out of the show, consider supporting the show. There's a link. Send me $5, $10, or you could use Podcasting 2.0. You could get a Podcasting 2.0 player and you could actually stream me money while you listen, right? For a very affordable way for you to be able to support a podcast. So there's so many different ways to extract value out of that podcast that don't involve CPMs and ads.
Yeah. Oh, I love all this. So much to unpack. So first of all, can you, for the people who might not know, what's Podcasting 2.0? What are you talking about here?
So Podcasting 2.0 is a movement that was started by one of the inventors of podcasting who just saw the way that it was going and was like, guys, we can do better. We don't have to be beholden to these, billion-dollar companies, trillion-dollar companies. We can actually build this innovation ourselves, like the good old days of RSS. And so that was Podcasting 2.0. And specifically, it's led to innovation in RSS and the way that we do RSS is the way that we share podcasting content that's independent. It's not it's decentralized. It's not dependent on one gatekeeper to hold it. And so because of that, we've been able to do really cool, innovative things like including transcripts inside of RSS feeds, where that wasn't something that was originally in there, to be able to put information about the hosts, to do things to help protect podcasts from being copied. So there's like different innovations that have come out of podcasting 2.0. Oh, and the value for value that I was just talking about, that came out of the podcasting 2.0 community, where you can actually put information in your RSS feed so people can stream sats to you. So it's a form of Bitcoin. And so it's a little bit, that's a little bit of a stretch right now. It's kind of hard for people to be able to do that. But, there's great companies that are out there that are actually doing things to make that easier, so that it might be transparent to you. You can load $10 in your wallet and start streaming your sats without ever knowing that it's actually being done by crypto.
Yeah, love that. Then you mentioned another thing. So you mentioned subscription-based. I want to dig into this just for my own curiosity and knowledge. Out of a $14 CPM, what's everybody's share in this? Like, I suppose the ads is, so the brand that is named is probably going through an ad agency or Buzzsprout directly. Like, what ends up in the podcaster's pockets out of these $14? Is it the end result, or is this the lion's share, and then there is everybody that needs to take a share? How does it work?
Yeah, well, let me make sure I qualify this. Like, I do not know. Let me just qualify this. I do not know a lot about the traditional ad agencies and how they work. I know how Buzzsprout ads works, because that's how much we charge. $20 and we give $14
right
to the podcaster. And so the rest is to cover, the credit card fees and the costs associated with the feature. But we're not trying to make money. That's not our value prop is we want to provide value to our podcasters. The only reason that there's a markup in there at all is to help cover the expenses associated with the program. But as that continues to grow, we may actually see our margin go down, because the podcasters are paying us for the service, for the hosting. So anyways, but I don't know how it works with other agencies. I would imagine it all comes down to how much effort you put in, right? The more effort you put in, the bigger the portion that you get to keep. If the agency is bringing you all of the advertisers, then they're going to keep, a big chunk of that, whenever they bring in the door. But the actual numbers, I'm a horrible person to ask.
No, but that already makes a lot of sense. So in the case of Buzzsprout, it's about 1/3, a bit less. And I suppose it will be pretty similar in any other ad agency-based monetization, because you would have to indeed cover for all the costs. Now, you mentioned something interesting here, subscription-based. So that's a potential other avenue of monetization, right? How do you see this happening? The reason I'm asking is because you have, so I think Apple Podcasts and Spotify both have their options, like you can choose to ask your audience to subscribe, basically. You mentioned something around Buzzsprout doing that. I know that lots of people might go for a Patreon or buy me a coffee type of thing, like Patreon if you want to provide something additional. Hey, for the people who want to pay me a little bit of money, I will release episodes earlier, or like share some Q&A, or like AMA or whatever with the guests I have. And buy me a coffee is just like, hey, support the show and give some money. Kind of donation like you would see on Twitch, for instance. But so what's your view on this? Do you see this as a more kind of viable avenue for monetization of a podcast that just adds insertion, or what's your feeling about it?
I'm glad you asked, because this is something that I am passionate about. I feel like podcasters need to do a better job of educating listeners. Listeners love listening to podcasts, right? Typically, if somebody listens to one podcast, they listen to two podcasts, right? They listen to more than one podcast. They enjoy that type of consumption. And there's also this strange relationship that exists between podcast listeners and podcast hosts. Like, we know that it's just different. It's a different type of relationship, that they want more interaction. They want to they feel like they know the podcast host. There's a trust that goes there. And so I feel like podcasters can do a better job of educating listeners of like, hey, I hope you enjoy the show. I hope you get a lot out of it. But just so you know, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen magically. Like, I put a lot of work into this, and it's a hobby. or maybe it's my business, but I want you to know this is what it is. And sharing that, and then giving them the opportunity to share. Look, I don't want to put ads in front of you, but at the end of the day, this is costing me time. It's costing me money. I want to buy new equipment. I want to do this other thing. And so educate your listeners and say, look, I'm not trying to guilt you. If you don't get anything out of this podcast, do not send me a dime. But if you get anything out of this podcast, please consider supporting the show. I feel like every podcaster should say that. I don't care if you've got 100 downloads or 10,000 downloads. Giving your listeners, though, the opportunity to support the show is actually inviting them to participate in what you're doing. So you could do that through, we have Buzzsprout subscriptions. You could do that through Patreon. You could do it through Buy Me Coffee. You could do it through like Podcasting 2.0, Value for Value. True Fans is a player that's out there that makes it really simple for your listeners to be able to engage with your content and then stream dollars while they're listening to it. And I just think there's really good ways out there to invite your listeners to support the show that everyone should be taken care of. And one of the most dangerous things in podcasting, I think, is the podcaster sign off that says, hey, wherever you listen to podcasts, hey, you can find this podcast wherever, download it wherever you listen. It's like, no, we should be educating our listeners. Hey, look, if you listen to this podcast on True Fans, or if you listen to this on a Podcasting 2.0, you can actually support the show. Educating listeners and giving them, look, if you really want to support the show, consider doing this. Doesn't mean you can't get it on these other places. I'm not saying that. And if you're not getting any value, don't send me any money. But if you do, and so I've talked to podcasters and they're like, well, but I don't do premium content. And I'm like, dude, everything you do is premium content. Right? Like, it's not like you're not creating garbage content. You're trying to create premium content. And so I'm not a fan. We do it. Buzzsprout supports, like, you can put up a paywall and say, okay, this content is only available if you support the show, But I'm not a big fan of that, because typically what you're doing is taking a portion of your content and, moving it away so that your listeners can't hear it. Well, that's how people can really engage with your content and find out more about you and become fans of the show and all those kind of things. And so in general, I say, man, put that content out there and then ask them to support the show. Give them the best content. Say, look, I don't want to put up a paywall. I don't want to do ads. I don't want to do these different things. Consider supporting the show.
Yeah. I love that, Tom. And let me give you and our audience a bit of the secret sauce as well that we give to our clients typically. Like, the first thing we say when we onboard somebody is like typically advice on how to do better with the podcast, right? Like, just it's as simple as the structure. And we do say you need to have a call to action at the beginning and the end of the podcast. But then it can be whatever, right? If you're a B2B business, for instance, and your intention is to network with the greatest minds into your industry, but then you also want to have those guests tap into your audience, you want that audience to be as big as possible. At the beginning, you can say something as simple as, hey, if you enjoyed the show, if you learned something today, please consider subscribing or following on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us reach more people, and that would mean the world to us. Typically, asking something like this, asking for the audience help, increases the engagement. And of course, we say there is no obligation at all, but know that this will help me, and that will mean the world to me because it helps me help more people. Boom, and you have your call to action. And if that is directing people towards your Patreon, people will be okay. If you don't ask, you will very likely not get anything, especially from a format where, as you said, Tom, people are listening whilst driving, commuting, folding laundry. They are doing something else at the same time. So they won't deliberately do something if you don't ask them to. But it can be a very, very efficient way to grow your podcast or start monetizing it, or indeed educating your listeners on certain part of the podcast.
And there is a different relationship between podcast listeners and other mediums where they want to help. Like they genuinely feel a connection to the podcast host. And so a call to action is really an invitation for them to participate in what it is that you're doing.
100%. Okay, so we have covered kind of basic ads insertion. We have covered the subscription base. You also have covered the fact of potentially networking and having this as a business card, so generating leads with it. What can you expect from a typically, let's say, a sponsor on a D&D podcast that sells dice that allows you to only roll crits, for instance? Quite useful for the D&D fans. How much people could expect? How much can you negotiate I mean, I don't even know if we still talk about CPM here or if it's even like cost per click. How much do you think, how far can a sponsorship contract go when it's like super qualified, super targeted? Any metrics to share with us on that?
I don't have any metrics to share, but I can tell you, I'm an entrepreneur. I like risk. I also like value for dollars and thinking through how valuable is it. And in my mind, the most ideal is, hey, I'm gonna promote your dice. I'm gonna use a specific code, and I would like 20% of the sales or whatever, a percentage of whatever the sales are, right? Mm-hmm. So now I'm not charging you for impressions. I'm not charging you for some ethereal thing. I'm saying, look, if you make a sale, I get paid, you get paid. We're both in it together. That's a great relationship. Now, it requires trust and it requires a little bit of technology to be able to make sure that they followed the link, right? But again, a good call to action, listeners that are engaged with your content, there's a good chance if you're promoting products that they're actually interested in, you could actually do really well. So now you're talking about, okay, maybe I'm promoting dice, but maybe instead of promoting dice, it's a monthly subscription for a service. And so now I could actually get recurring revenue just from referring. So anyways, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can extract value out of your podcast. If you are going to go down that path of an affiliate, I like working a deal where I only make money when you do.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you've got to figure out how you're going to do it. Let's say I get 10,000 downloads a month. So I've got to put a dollar value on that to a guy who's selling Dungeons & Dragons dice for $29, right? Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, he's got to figure out how many sales do I think I could make to your 10,000 downloads to justify whatever you're going to charge me. That's the value that's being exchanged and negotiated, right? Yeah. And so I think we just have to think that way. We're in an interesting spot with Buzzsprout ads because Buzzsprout ads, podcasters can buy ads to run on other podcasts, okay? So podcasters buy the ads and podcasters approve the ads to go into their podcasts. And what's funny is you'll have podcasters on the podcast side say, I should be making so much money off of my downloads. But then when they buy the ad, they're like, gosh, I'm paying $200 for this. This isn't that valuable. And you're like, okay, wait a minute. Like, I'm not saying that we're right, you're wrong. I'm just saying, where do we set the value? How valuable are those downloads, right? When you were talking about your downloads, they are so valuable. But when you're buying them in other people's podcasts, they're not valuable at all. And so, the industry is learning. The industry is, trying to figure this out. The problem is it's being dictated mostly by these more brand lift, generic CPM type companies.
Yeah. Matt, so many golden nuggets in here. Tom, can you talk to me about Buzzsprout Analytics? I'm asking this because it's kind of, I don't know if I can say the reference, but a big reference in the podcast space, especially when the news burst out about Spotify taking over Apple Podcasts, right? In number of downloads. The articles, the editors base themselves on Buzzsprout Analytics. So it's taken rather seriously within the industry. What can you tell me about Buzzsprout Analytics that we cannot see? What else do you have access to that is super interesting for the podcasting world, for eventually podcasters that you display or do not display? What's your two takes on Buzzsprout Analytics?
Sure. First, let me put a massive qualifier on Buzzsprout.
Do so.
These statistics that we're providing are across the Buzzsprout platform. So, for instance, our April numbers, we looked at over 124,000 podcasts. But those 124,000 podcasts are smaller, independent podcasts, right? If you are in the top 1% of podcasts, you're probably not on Buzzsprout, right? Unless you're monetizing yourself, which some people are doing, you're probably outsourcing that to somebody else, and with that, you've left. You're on a different platform, right? But the 99% of the podcasters that are a good fit for Buzzsprout, so it has to be taken with a grain of salt. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is you're looking at 108 million downloads is what we had last month. Well, you can have a podcast. You can have a single podcast that signs up for Buzzsprout that does really well on Spotify. So let's say that they are one of those 1% podcasts and they are monetizing themselves. Well, they join Buzzsprout. Well, they bring with them 1 million plus downloads. You see that? And so those numbers can swing. That Apple and Spotify number can swing dramatically based on the makeup of the customer base at Buzzsprout. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt, when you're looking at that number. So all that to say, the numbers are good, but you have to understand what they are. They are the numbers across the Buzzsprout platform of all of our podcasts. We want to share any way that we can. And we wish other hosts would do it, right? Because it would help so that we could compare. Well, is it just Buzzsprout that saw a spike in Spotify, or did other people see it as well? So that's the big qualification on that. Some other things that I'd say there that people don't see is how much, and I can say this, right? Because my customer is the podcast. It's not the advertiser. There are so many different ways that people game their statistics. There are so many IAB compliant downloads that are clearly bogus. And depending on which host you're with, your statistics may or may not be, very accurate. And so we see it all the time. We see it all the time with Buzzsprout, where somebody will switch over to Buzzsprout and they're like, oh man, I switched my RSS feed and now my downloads are much smaller than they were before. And so people aren't listening. And I'm like, no, people are still listening. It's just we take our statistics we want to provide the most accurate stats we can to our podcasters. And because of that, we are more likely to block traffic that might be IAB compliant, but we've determined, you know what, this is not legit. This is not legit traffic. And so because of that, you will see more accurate numbers from Buzzsprout, but more accurate is never bigger. Podcasters always want the numbers to be bigger. And so that's one of the drawbacks. But I see just a lot of people gaming the system. And I don't think it's necessarily the podcaster. I think there's companies out there. We know they're out there, right? And they reach out to podcasters and they say, look, what if I told you I could get you, 10,000 downloads, for X dollars? And all they're doing is just turning on some type of either they're actual people that are doing it, or they have devices or software or things that are creating all this fake statistics. So anyways, I'm glad to say people won't see that, but we certainly see it. When we launched Buzzsprout ads, it became very important for us too, because now we're paying. We feel like we owe it to our advertiser to make sure that the downloads are legit. And so we had to kind of level up, even as accurate as our stats were, we had to level them up even more.
This is getting controversial. I love it. So talk to me about those downloads that are IAB compliant but not legit. What could that typically be? Like those softwares that you mentioned, how do you know that those are non-legit downloads exactly? How does it all work?
So typically what you'll see is a bunch of consecutive IP addresses that are all associated with a VPN, for example, and they're downloading the same episode hundreds of times, right? Now, an IAB download will only count it once for every 24 hours per IP address. And so what's happening is the IP address is changing consecutively. So that way, you see this massive block of downloads, but they are downloading the content. So it's qualifying as a real download, but it's not really legit.
So how do you do technically then? Because you see this, so Buzzsprout will account for download, but then you go back and say, wait a second, this is a kind of a red flag, and you have to go through the details of which sequence of IP address have downloaded the same episode over and over again without actually listening to it, obviously, or maybe even with listening to it. Like, how do you technically fix those numbers? Is it something post-downloads, or do you have like softwares that identify this right away?
Yeah, I wish. No, right now it's very manual. There's a lot of audits that get triggered. And typically it's me that goes in and I'm auditing numbers and I'm looking for patterns. And then once I find the pattern, then I start doing analysis across all of our podcasts and I can see, oh, okay, now I can see this. But at that point, we don't go back and change numbers. What we'll do is we'll either block the downloads or we'll block the statistics. but we're not going to go back in history and take people. Man, if you take people's downloads away, they'll come after you with pitchfork and yeah, you don't want to do that.
100%. But so platforms do boost numbers. And to be fair, I haven't seen that with Buzzsprout. I have a few names in mind that I will obviously not mention, but we had clients come to us, either switching platforms or like getting back to their previous numbers, and we saw some anomalies. And the best thing we can do there, if you're listening to this and wondering what's true from false, a very good thing is just to go within Apple Podcast Analytics and within Spotify for Podcasters Analytics and already see, because those ones account for certain downloads a certain way, where you have other platforms, hosting and distribution platforms that will clearly inflate numbers. And it's a bit shocking because we're like, you onboard a client as a podcast marketing agency and you start working on it and you see, wait a second, we migrated platform and now I'm down two-folds the downloads. I'm like, yeah, but actually we look at Apple Podcasts and Spotify, your downloads are growing, but there are certain things that are accounted for that shouldn't. So it is a real thing, and I don't think that's good for the industry, to be honest. That's actually pretty much of a pity. Tom, a question I always...
Let me say this about it, right? The reason that our statistics can be played and manipulated is because there is not one governing gatekeeper. The advantage of podcasting is also the disadvantage on stats, right?
Yeah.
Because you could host it anywhere, and yeah, you could listen to it through Apple or you could listen to it through Spotify, but you could also listen to it through any number of other podcast clients that are out there, right? Like it's totally open. That openness makes it very difficult and privacy centric, right? Like I don't want to share IP information across. I don't want to take listeners' information and then share that with anybody else, right? Yeah. I don't believe that's when somebody goes and listens to a podcast, they don't expect that you're actually looking up their IP address to get information about them, other than the location. That's the only thing that we do. But I think that's what comes with being open, being privacy centric. Your stats are going to be, harder to understand the nuance,
Yeah. But so to this, I want to answer, Tom. Isn't that the role of the IAB? Actually, can you maybe quickly explain for people who don't know what the IAB is and what they are meant to represent?
From our perspective, the IAB provides guidelines. They are the minimum guidelines for how a podcast hosting company should be capturing stats. Mm-hmm. It's not great. It's subjective. And like I said, it's the minimum. There's tons of downloads that are IAB compliant that should not be counted. But it's very, like I said, it's very subjective. It's not a systematic thing. So is it their fault? No, it's not their fault, but they're creating this false sense of security that if it's an IAB certified download, it's legit. Well, not really. That's a minimum check to see if it's a legitimate download. There's still things on top of that you would want to look at.
Yeah. I mean, not to play the devil's advocate here, but quite the contrary, actually. Why do you put so much effort into identifying the true from false downloads where other platforms as big as Buzzsprout or within the same sphere are not? Like, why is it important to you? Because one could argue that for those other platforms, they're also a relay between the advertisers and the podcast and the listeners, right? So why do you make this choice of being super strict about it?
I think that's a great question. It's what we ask ourselves. We ask ourselves, we're like, why are we doing this? Our podcasters don't like it if their numbers are, lower than they want them to be. But we just think we want that reputation. We want podcasters to know when they look at the numbers that we care about those numbers, that we're not just, letting those things, come through there. And we also like our Buzzsprout Ads product where there is an opportunity to be privacy centric and do it with integrity in terms of doing your downloads, where you can sell ads and do that. And so we still believe in that product, and we still believe that there is a space for that lowest tier of monetization. But it requires that you are somewhat vigilant in making sure that, hey, are these numbers real? because people are making decisions based off of this. And in the case of advertisers, they're spending actual money.
Yeah, and I like how this is playing the long game, right? Because yes, in the short term, you might be benefiting from inflating numbers, but eventually the industry will find out, because if you have advertisers putting tons of money because you have tons of downloads, I'm putting quotation marks for people not following with the video, and at some point that will be found out.
Tom, the value proposition, from the advertiser's perspective, the value proposition is not that somebody is going to hear my ad. That's not what they're paying for. What they're doing is they're selling a product, they're selling a service, they're doing something that's not just the act of the download. And so, like you said, it's going to be found out. The advertisers are going to come back, like we're already seeing in some cases, where the advertisers are saying it's just not worth what I'm paying. Well, why isn't it worth what you're paying? Well, because there's a good 30% of your downloads that are just fake. They're not real. So that just ate up 30% of your budget right there. So I think you're right that there is a long game there. And there is something to be said for, hey, we have to deliver on the value of what we sold.
Yeah. I love that. There is a question I have always wanted to ask somebody like you, who is in the very details of how this whole machine works. We had a client come to us one day, migrating from a hosting platform, and his previous service provider was like, oh yeah, you need to create 2 RSS feeds, one for Apple Podcast and one for Spotify, in order to get the most out of both. Is that a thing? Like, why? What could be the reason for that to be, if that's even something? Or was that service provider just trying to sell 2 RSS feed service maintenance?
I think for Buzzsprout, we've never done that. So we always have one RSS feed. It's the same RSS feed that will serve to Apple as to Spotify. There are advantages to having multiple podcasts, because I could, put an episode that's only available in Apple, or an episode that's only available in Spotify. There are things that you could do with that, but it's adding complexity that doesn't need to be there. And so I would say you really don't need that. Unless you actually have a business use case for it, I would not have multiple RSS feeds.
Okay, but there is no technical advantage of doing so, because that person, that service provider was arguing that you would get more downloads and more exposure from having 2 separate RSS feeds than having only one, because then Apple Podcasts will see that as a unique thing that goes to Apple, and they will boost your numbers more, like put your content in front of more people. There is no such thing.
Yeah, there's no such thing.
Okay, super clear. Well, I was wondering.
Yeah.
So what about the marketing of Buzzsprout? Because I'm looking at 16 years of clearly a successful journey. What I, as a marketing aficionado or amateur or connoisseur, depending on the field, I can't help but see Buzzsprout almost everywhere. Like I'm Googling something about podcast hosting, and I see Buzzsprout as being the first result. I'm reading my daily newsletter of Pod News, James Cridland, amazing work. Thanks for coming on the show as well. And Buzzsprout is first sponsor. You go on anything that has to do with podcast hosting or podcasting, and you see Buzzsprout. Can you talk to me about that marketing strategy of Buzzsprout, which is clearly omnipresent and obviously efficient, because you wouldn't be where you are right now if it wasn't for this, or one of the components, I guess. But again, why that choice? How does it work internally when you discuss marketing?
Yeah, sure. I think the way I would describe our strategy is we want to provide content that helps podcasters, and we want that to be our marketing, right? We have so many podcasters that come up to us at a conference, and they know our content, they're familiar with Buzzsprout, but they actually launched their podcast on Anchor. And still like, well, what? But one day I'm going to come to Buzzsprout, like one day, right? Because what happened is they didn't want to spend any money. They weren't willing. They weren't at that level. But then they'll come to us, a year later, and then be like, oh my gosh, I switched over. It's amazing. So it's like this long relationship that we develop by educating podcasters, even if they're not going to use Buzzsprout. We don't care. Well, I mean, we care, obviously. We do care. Let me just make sure I say that. We want you to use Buzzsprout. But at the end of the day, we want to educate podcasters. We want to have that kind of relationship with the industry, that they feel like Buzzsprout is for podcasters, whether they use Buzzsprout or not. We have great relationships with our competitors. We put out a lot of great content that doesn't directly relate to podcast hosting, how to choose a microphone or how to, hone in your outline and your content and things like that in the old days we would have never done. But we recognized this, 2018, 2017, we really started building content that in the old days we would have said, no, we don't build that content because we're just a hosting company. We don't want to get into recommending a microphone. But then we realized, wait a minute, but podcasters get hung up on picking a microphone. So why wouldn't we help them? Even if it doesn't necessarily link to Buzzsprout, it's like, oh, well, use this microphone because it's the best thing for Buzzsprout. It's the best for the podcaster. So that's a big part of it. And then there is a lot of paid acquisition where we're paying for people to find out about Buzzsprout because there are so many people that are getting into podcasting. We just want to make sure that we're putting our name in front of them. If they don't run it across a piece of our content, then maybe they're going to run across, our ad. But we are pretty, I don't want to say stingy. Are we stingy? We are efficient in the way that we spend our money. Like we track it. We make sure that we're not, throwing money away. We're spending money in the places where podcasters are to let them know about Buzzsprout.
Yeah. Does Buzzsprout have a podcast?
Yeah. Buzzcast is one of our podcasts. Buzzcast is my co-founder, Kevin, who's really the product, the designer, developer, like all UI, UX is Kevin. If it was me that designed it, like you would hate it and we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Because I am just on the technical side. But anyways, so Kevin is on that show. Alvin Brooks, our head of marketing, he's on there. And Jordan is on there. Jordan is one of our podcasters who came on staff to help us with podcasting, like actually building our own podcasts. We also have another podcast called Happy to Help, which we just launched, I think last month, which is about customer support and how you can help teams, provide remarkable support. And that's run by the head of our support team, Priscilla Brook.
Okay. Are those hosted on Buzzsprout?
Yeah, they are hosted on, and it's a great test bed for us. So we just launched the feed last week for texting the show, and we had it on Buzzcast, and we got to experiment with and Happy to Help. We had it on both those podcasts so we could experiment with them before we released it to 100,000 podcasts.
Yeah, love it. You've talked quite a few times about events where you meet podcasters, Tom. What are the normies? What are the events that you and the Buzzsprout team are like, hey, years after year after year, we need to be at those events? What are the unmissable podcast events out there?
We love Podfest and Podcast Movement. They are two conferences in the U.S. that allow independent podcasters to get together, share war stories, get strategies, get ideas. We think it's valuable enough that we typically provide our customers, we give away a pool of tickets to get customers to go to these conferences because we want to help them. We want to help them keep podcasting. It's in their interest. It's in our interest, right? They signed up because they wanted to, be a great podcaster. And so sending them to these conferences we think is valuable enough that we actually give away tickets for people to be able to go and experience it.
Pretty cool. May 8th. Wait a minute. Podfest Asia, sorry. And you're probably talking about the one in the U.S.
In the U.S., yeah. And the Podfest is typically in Orlando, and we are just up the road in Jacksonville, Florida. And so that's great. The whole team gets to go down and interact with podcasters, yeah.
What's the future of podcasting, Tom? We've talked about video, but what else do you see and feel yourself and at Buzzsprout as being the thing that you cannot miss as a podcaster, but also as a hosting and distribution company?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew.
You would be rich.
Here's my hope. I'll tell you my hope is that podcasting continues to be independent and it continues to ward off a YouTube or a Spotify trying to own it and become the gatekeepers, and it becomes just another YouTube, right? If you look at YouTube, there's no good competitor for YouTube for like long form video content that's, content created, that has content creators. Like there's one way to monetize it with YouTube. There's one way to, if they demonetize you, you're demonetized. If they tell you you're not appropriate for the platform, you're off the platform. That's not good. And I think we saw Spotify jogging for that position. Now we kind of see YouTube trying to redefine podcasting so that maybe they can be that. But my hope is that it continues to be independent, and then we start to see other players pick up steam so that maybe we have some competitors for Apple and Spotify, right? Right now, that's 70-80% of the downloads are going to happen on one of those players. What would be great would be a Pocket Casts or True Fans or one of these Podcasting 2.0 players start to gain some traction and provide something that you can't get with Spotify or Apple.
Love that. You know what, Tom? I think I'm going to start asking this question instead of what's the future of podcasting. What's your hope for podcasting?
Yeah.
That's so much better.
Because if I knew, I would be betting all in.
And you would be rich and you would share with Guillaume from Podcast Gurus, right? What's the question that nobody asks you about podcasting, Tom, that you think, my God, there is so much potential here. There is so much things to be explored here that nobody is asking about because they don't see it as the priority. But what's the thing you wish people and podcasters would ask you more?
I don't know if this is directly answering your question. I wish podcasters would spend more time thinking about what they want to get out of the show. Why did you start your podcast? I wish they could clearly articulate that, because it provides so much clarity when they get bombarded with all this facts and figures out there. When they go, no, this is why I started my podcast. I just wanted to talk about Dungeons & Dragons because I love playing Dungeons & Dragons. Or Star Wars. I want to start a Star Wars podcast because I want to connect with other Star Wars geeks about all the latest things happening in Star Wars. And how will I judge the success of my podcast is, am I having fun? Am I connecting with people that I enjoy connecting with? Right? If you can define success, there is the best chance that you're going to achieve it. If you don't, then it's going to be defined for you. And it's going to be defined in a way that will suck the life out of you. And podcasting is just too hard, right? Yeah. To have that happen. And so I think that's something that every time I speak at any event, when I don't care what the topic is, at some point I'm going to make the point that you as a podcaster should really ask yourself the question of, why did you get into podcasting? What was it that you wanted to achieve so that you can define success rather than having it defined for you?
Boom. Mic drop. I have 3 questions for you to close this interview, Tom, which was absolutely amazing, by the way. The first one is, so what's your Enneagram personality? I didn't get to ask you at the beginning, but Enneagram, is that it?
Yeah, the Enneagram.
Enneagram.
I am either a 7 or an 8. I'm either an 8-wing 7 or a 7-wing 8.
What does that even mean, actually?
I am extroverted.
Okay.
But I enjoy being in control. Okay. There's a lot.
It's interesting. It's super interesting. That's cool. Okay, second one is 3 podcasts that you listen to that you will recommend me and our audience. Like, what does Tom Rossi from Buzzsprout listens to on his free time? Yeah,
well, definitely I have to say the ones that we do. And happy to help. Okay. Let's not have those.
It will be in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. Pod News Weekly, for sure. The Podcasting 2.0 show I will listen to with Adam and Dave, where they're talking about all the different things that are going on in the Podcasting 2.0 community. And I love leading a team and culture and things like that. So I listen to a lot of leadership podcasts. And the leadership podcast that I really enjoy is one by a guy named Andy Stanley. And it's a Andy Stanley Leadership Podcast, I think is what it's called. And it's my favorite leadership podcast.
Love that. Will definitely. So Pod News Weekly, obviously, I listen to as well. Podcasting 2.0, I will give it a try. And who knows, I might find gems into leadership podcasts as well. Last question, Tom. Probably the most critical of this whole interview.
Uh-oh. Big build up.
Let's the tension build a bit. When do we start a D&D podcast?
Yeah. I'm there. I mean, there's so much to Dungeons & Dragons. I mean, so much since I was a kid. It's so much more complicated. So I'm just trying to play Baldur's Gate, and I'm like learning all these different things that I had no idea. And you go and you start reading Reddits or subreddits, and oh my gosh, there's so much you can do.
Most OP classes. So, I mean, we are towards the end. So the people staying until now are hardcore anyways. So what class do you play on Dungeons and Dragons then? What's your play style? What's your gaming style, though?
I like the what do they call it? The Gloomstalker.
Gloomstalker.
Yeah, it's like a paladin.
Okay.
Declass it. Yeah. And you get all these attacks and mostly ranged. You get sneak. You can sneak and pop up and attack. Yeah.
Love it, man. It got complicated. I just finished the game with Sorcerer. I think it's said in English, man. Just fireballs the hell out of anybody. And that's done. That's done.
There's so many spells. I mean,
yeah.
And you can build a whole strategy around whatever spell you like, you know?
But man, the ramifications of the details that they've gotten into, like in terms of spells, gameplay, what spells would have as an effect. Like you can talk to the dead. Actually, one of the developer was explaining that to walk around this in the places they didn't want people to talk to the dead, they were just chopping off their heads. So you cannot cast that spell. And man, it was if you're a bit of a gamer and you haven't played Baldur's Gate 3 yet, go for it. It's just an amazing game.
Yeah, but just clear off your schedule.
Yeah, 100%. 100%, especially if you do it in duo, because then you need to clear off 2 schedules and it's even harder to get on. But man, amazing. Tom, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Growth. It was amazing.